Hello and welcome to another episode of Terribly Drawn History. Today, we are going to be discussing the causes of World War I. World War I was a global conflict, fought mainly in Europe, but also in colonies in Africa as well as parts of the Middle East. To truly understand the war, one must first analyze the causes. There are four broad concepts we are going to look at to better compartmentalize the lead up to the war, which can otherwise be confusing. The first of these causes we'll discuss is the rise of militarism. Militarism was not at all a new concept for the nations involved. In fact, it was quite prevalent, and the whole reason the war was so catastrophic was because of this fairly primitive belief that war can be beneficial because it can thin out weak members of society. For many leaders, and even common people, war meant a call to defend your country, as well as an opportunity to gain honor or glory. This belief in war as an exceptional state of affairs for countries led to an arms race. Countries were building up their armies and were eager to use them on the battlefield to acquire more territory as well as prestige. This concept is almost entirely responsible for the way the war was fought on many fronts. Hordes of men charging into action to meet the enemy head-on in the battle. While 20 to 30 years prior, this tactic was quite feasible and reasonable. With the emergence of modern military technology that directly countered this tactic, the effectiveness became close to zero. This is why you see things such as the 12th Battle of the Isonzo River, we definitely butchered that, where Italian commanders would repeatedly try to take the same strategic points using the same methods, resulting in more than 1 million casualties for both them and the Austrians. Military commanders would foolishly rely on the same plan, time and time again, that would result in massive losses of life. Next on our list of causes is the complicated alliance systems that many European nations found themselves in. Much of the ties that bonded many European nations were actually treaties set up during the Napoleonic era and shortly after, in order to secure each other's interests. There were two major alliance systems that formed, and while some members were known, most of these agreements were often done in secret. If you look at the image on screen, you could see how nations were not directly tied to each other through the system, but instead had a mutual ally. These alliance systems would already set the teams for the future conflict. The main problem with the system was that two major nations, Germany and Russia, backed two opposing smaller nations, Austria-Hungary and Serbia. This meant that a conflict between the two could drag the whole continent into a war. Both Germany and Russia's ties to these smaller countries were not widely known, and it was not clear the extent to which their relations went, further adding to the complexity of the issue. Spoiler alert, this would end in a war. The next concept to be tackled on this episode is the rise of nationalism in various countries throughout the world. In fact, one could consider this a historical phenomenon that affected almost every nation state at the time. Nationalism is the idea of tying one's personal identity to that of their nation. An insult to one's country is no longer seen as a criticism of the government or the ruling class, but rather as a personal attack. On the contrary, success of the nation can also be viewed as personal gain to the average citizen. Although this idea was not new in the early 20th century, it was now seen on a global scale. Let's think back to the French Revolution, where the modern idea of nationalism began to reverberate throughout Europe. During the Revolution, the only way to mobilize masses of men to continue fighting was to unite the people under one common ideal. This was the idea that they were all French, and far superior to any others. They called upon masses of men to defend the tricolor flag, which would become a national symbol. Jumping back to World War I, where many nations embraced this idea, not only for better cohesion, but because it was actually believed. This idea made it hard for nations to negotiate any type of de-escalation, as all sides believed that their technology, men, and strategy were far better than any other nation. Victory for them was assured. You can also still see the effects of nationalism during the war, where propaganda was geared towards calling the citizens to action, echoing the ideals of militarism that these men could earn honor and glory for themselves and their nation. These claims by the state would succeed in the mission of convincing millions of men to volunteer, seeking glory in a dishonorable war. The last piece of this puzzle would be European imperialism. A few years prior to the beginning of the First World War, almost every major European nation had established control over territories abroad in both Africa and Asia. Many European nations had little to no natural resources that were needed to build up their expanding armies. To do this, they looked to the resource-rich areas that were previously mentioned. By the time of the 20th century, European nations had effectively colonized up to 80% of the world. Many countries, especially Germany, wanted to expand their colonial holdings in order to acquire more resources and expand their military. These colonial holdings were not only a prize for any nation that could acquire them, but in many cases they became the future site of battles that would be fought during the World War I. All of these factors created a powder keg that would be set off at the slightest spark. Although they were all quite distinct ideals and phenomena that was going on at the time, they are quite interconnected in a way that they contributed to set up the stage for the First World War. Nations had the technology to wage war on a more destructive scale than ever before. Nations were eager to seek new land abroad, Nations, as well as their citizens, were almost all willing to fight other nations for personal glory and to prove that their nation was superior. Lastly, the major nations of Europe had already chosen their sides prior to the conflict. Ultimately, an action that would have most likely resulted in a small-scale war, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, would have erupted an all-out war between the major nations of the First World War. When Austria-Hungary, with German backing, sent an ultimatum to the Serbian government that they knew would be denied, and the Serbian government, with the support of Russia, believed that they had the support to deny it. I'd like to end this video with a quote from Otto von Bismarck, the man who united Germany. He said, quote, "One day, the great European war will come out of some damn foolish thing in the Balkans." End quote. This was said in 1888, and he was 100% right. Thank you guys so much for tuning into another episode of Terribly Drawn History. Remember to like and subscribe, and leave any comments about any other future video ideas you have. Thank you so much. Signing off.